Welcome to the book of Esther. So, the book of Esther is the last book in the history series, and the next series that we actually move on to is the poetry series. So, who was Esther? Esther was a Jewish orphan, and her original Jewish name was called Hadassah, and she came from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that was the tribe of Benjamin. So she lived in the Persian capital of Susa during the exile, and she was adopted and raised by her cousin Mordecai. So Mordecai was the son of Esther's father's brother. So during that 70 years that the Jews suffered from the Babylonian exile that we saw in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we see that God raised up several people to guide and direct his people back to himself and back to Jerusalem. And we learned in the past about Zerubbabel, who was commissioned to build the temple, Ezra, who was commissioned to teach the Torah, and Nehemiah, who was commissioned to build the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And today we're going to take a look at Esther as being one of them as well. Now, the two books of the Old Testament that do not mention the name of God is the book of Esther and Song of Solomon or Song of Psalms. Yet, God's hand is more evident in the book of Esther than in any of the previous books. Now, the story is set just over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while we know and we've learned in the past that some of the Jews did return to Jerusalem under the first wave, second wave, and third wave, some did not. So the book of Esther is about this Jewish community who stayed back in the Persian Empire. And we find that the two main characters here are Mordecai and Esther, two of the Jews. And the king of Persia, King Ahasuerus, and we also learn about his cunning Persian official, Haman. Now, this story begins in Persia, where this king throws two elaborate banquet feasts, and this lasts about 187 days. And this is just to show his greatness. And on the last day of the feast, the king is actually quite drunk and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. Now, Queen Vashti refuses, and we find that the king, in a drunken rage, he rejects Queen Vashti as his queen. And he makes a silly decree that all the Persian men should be the master of their own homes, as to set an example. But the question that no one asks is, why did Queen Vashti decline the demand of the king? So according to most writings and research, Vashti was being commanded to do some inappropriate act publicly, or possibly she had just given birth or was still pregnant with her son. And Vashti knew that her refusal might mean her own death. Yet she was able to stand against her husband's orders. And it is clear that the king treated her as one of his possessions. And Vashti lost her crown because of her refusal. But yet she kept her dignity. So she was a very good queen, given very less credit in scripture. And she was a queen or woman of dignity. Now, King Ahasuerus' anger and alcohol abuse led him to make very foolish decisions. And at this point, it's a bit too late because he no longer has a wife to comfort and support him. And his servants notice his depression for a number of days, and so they hold a beauty pageant to find him a new queen. And the process in those days to find a queen was quite extensive. And we see that many women were taken from their families, and the number ranging from 400 to 1,460. But the saddest of all this is that these young women were misused and would only come back to see the king if he delighted in her the first time. So, meaning that the beauty contest in those days is not like the beauty contest of these days. Each woman would only come back the second time to be chosen only if the king delighted himself in her the first time. So, what would happen to the rest of these women that were not chosen? These misused young women lived the rest of their lives in a state of widowhood, or otherwise they would actually be used as the king's concubines for life, never returning home to their families. So this was really much abuse to women in that era. So we find that Esther hides a Jewish identity and she poses as a Persian, and we find that she wins the pageant after the process. Now the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her as the new queen, of Persia. And after this, Mordecai has an incident where he overhears two royal guards plotting to murder the king. Now, Mordecai at that point is a gatekeeper or a guard, as we may call him, and he informs Esther, who then informs the king, and we see that the king's life is saved. But Mordecai does not get any credit for it, or should I say, he gets no reward for it. And we find that even though God is not mentioned, that God's hand is definitely evident in this book of Esther. So in chapters 3 to 6, we see and we're now introduced to Haman. Haman is the King Ahasuerus' officials. And this guy is a descendant of the Canaanites. So the king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom and he demands that all may kneel before him. But the one person who doesn't kneel is Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to kneel, and Haman is filled with rage. And to make matters worse, Haman finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, so he persuades the king to enact a decree to destroy all the Jews. So obviously he has ulterior motives to get back to or to get back at Mordecai. So they decide the day of the horrific day or the date of this horrific day when the Jews will be destroyed, and that was the plan. So Haman and the king throw a party to celebrate this decree. So we find that Esther and Mordecai are the only hope for the Jewish people. So together, Esther and Mordecai plan to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask that the decree is reversed. And Mordecai assures Esther that if she doesn't do this, the deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, meaning that God will find another or raise up another for this assignment. And Mordecai also assures Esther that maybe she's become queen for this very moment. And Esther replies by saying, "If I perish, I perish." So she then decides to approach the king. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a banquet. And this banquet is for 2 days. So Haman leaves the first banquet quite drunk, happy with himself. And when he meets Mordecai in the street, Mordecai does not bow. Haman fumes with anger and then goes home. And together he and his wife, they come up with the idea of building a 75-foot high gallows where Mordecai will be impaled on it in the morning. So Mordecai refused to bow, and we know that Mordecai, very much like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, did not bow. And they did what was right without compromising their relationship with God. So these Jews that came from exile, some of them were very faithful. And although we see Meshach, Abednego, and Shadrach coming from a different time of exile. This is very similar to what Mordecai did. So that night the king could not sleep, and he sent for the royal chronicles to be read to him. And so while these chronicles are being read to him, he realizes that his life has been saved by Mordecai. Now, this event took place 5 years earlier. So basically, the king, only after 5 years, realizes that he never rewarded the man who actually saved his life. And it was very unusual in those days for Persian kings not to thank someone for a good deed or reward them, even in a lavish manner. But we can see that God had purposely allowed this to happen to accomplish his plans in his perfect timing. And like this, in our lives, we may feel that God has forgotten us, he has ignored the things we have done for him, or even promoted someone instead of us when we felt more deserving. But God's timing is not our timing. His plans are higher than our plans, just like heaven is higher than earth. So in the morning, as Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, as he and his wife had planned the previous night, the king instead orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. Haman then has to lead Mordecai about the city on a royal throne. Again, the reversal of what the enemy has planned. God turns it for good. So the next day, we see that Esther hosts the second banquet, and the king and Haman arrive. Esther informs the king of a Jewish identity. She also informs the king of the decree that Haman had brought to ploy and plot the murder of her, Mordecai, and the Jewish people. And after taking in a lot of wine and hearing Esther's news, King Ahasuerus goes into a drunken rage and orders that Haman, his official, be impaled on the stake he made for Mordecai. So Haman, hearing this, was out of his mind with fear. He pleaded at the feet of Esther in her room to spare him, and he ended up collapsing on top of her on the couch. And as King Ahasuerus returned to the room, he was under the impression that Haman was trying to take advantage of Esther. And so Haman was arrested immediately, and Haman was executed on the very same device he had built to execute his enemy, Mordecai. So a very, very interesting story with such a big message for us. And we see that Haman's execution doesn't solve the problem because the decree to kill the Jews still exists. So Esther and Mordecai work together to reverse the decree. And when they discover that the king can't revoke a decree is already made, Mordecai, as the new official under the king, who is now promoted, issues a counter decree. And on the day when the Jewish people were to be killed, the people can now defend themselves and destroy anyone who plotted to kill them. And so on the day that the decree comes, the Jews triumph over their enemies. And first they destroy Haman's family, along with the other Persian officials who had joined Haman's plot. So the next day, the Jewish people are allowed to destroy anyone who plotted against them and fight for themselves. So we find that a great joy and celebration happens because the Jewish people have been rescued from the annihilation that Haman had planned. So this is the reason why the Feast of Purim happens. It's for the people of Israel to celebrate that day of when the Jews were actually saved. And on that day of Purim, we find that the Jews read the story of Esther and they actually commemorate this day in celebration. Now, Esther is very similar to those of another young person in the Bible, and that is Joseph, because both of them were taken from their families, brought into slavery against their will. And Esther, like Joseph, got raised to a palace, and their lives were put at risk just to accomplish God's purpose. So we see again, God indeed takes care of those he has chosen to honor. And Haman was a man with a mirror only looking at himself, while Mordecai was a man with a window he could look through to see others. And we find that Mordecai never sought revenge on Haman. In fact, he remained silent through his whole ordeal and quietly and humbly went back to his job, putting his faith in the God of Israel. We see that the story of Esther is a parallel to the story of Christ. So, just like Jesus, Esther put herself in a place of potential death for the people, for the Jewish people. But she also risked her life also to do so. She worked as an intercessor and an advocate for the people, just as Christ lives now to intercede for us, his children. So the takeaway of this book is that as God builds us, our lives to become more than what he wants them to be, we will face difficulties such as mourning and grief and lack, limitation, sickness, disease, oppression, depression, and many other negative situations. And it may seem like he isn't in control or he has abandoned us, but we have seen that God is at work in our lives in even those things behind the scenes, and he often uses difficult situations to move us into place that he wants us to be in order for his plans to be fulfilled. So when Esther put on her royal robes, she was actually putting on her royalty. So we as people of God, we don't know the anointing and the authority we carry. And if we read the book of 1 Peter 2:9, we see that we are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his special people, that we may proclaim the praises of him who has called us. And I leave you with that, and I hope you enjoyed this book. It's a really exciting book to read. I encourage you to go read it, and I hope this Bible study makes sense to you and brings more understanding. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting this channel. Please join us for more. Take care and God bless.